If you were to take all four members of my family, my wife Alan, my daughters Alan and Leela, and myself, if you were to take all four of us and ask each one of us separately, what's the single worst sermon we've ever heard? I'm pretty sure that all four of us would give exactly the same answer. And thankfully, it's not one of mine. Now, I have certainly preached my share of bad sermons. And there are times that I find myself in the middle of a sermon that's just not working out like I thought it would and thinking, this is really bad. But even then, I don't think I've ever preached a sermon as bad as the one that I have in mind. We heard this particular sermon at a large, very large actually, Presbyterian church in Florida, church that shall remain nameless. While we were there one summer on vacation, it was a sermon on the subject of what it is like to be different. And the problem was that this very serious subject was treated in anything but a serious manner, resulting, frankly, in a sermon that was not just bad, it was an embarrassment. And if the sermon itself were not bad enough, it was accompanied by a solo sung by one of the members of their choir, a song that was entitled, "It's Not Easy Being Green," a song that some of you may know, written by Jim Henson and originally performed on Sesame Street by Kermit the Frog. Needless to say, I cannot see any of our choir members singing that song. And all of this would have been okay if this had been part of a children's sermon, though frankly, children deserve better than this. But no, all of this was intended as the main sermon for that day. Now, let me emphasize again that the problem with the sermon wasn't the topic, a very serious topic for all of us today in this increasingly diverse world, where we're all having to learn to live and interact with people who are different from us. The problem was that this very serious issue was not taken seriously at all. Instead, we were merely subjected to one superficial cliche after another, as if dealing with differences were just a matter of everyone's trying to be nicer, which of course doesn't even begin to deal with the true complexity of the differences that in fact exist among us, differences that can make everyday life quite a challenge. For one thing, the sermon completely ignored the fact that there is a very big difference between being different simply by virtue of who a person is, some things over which we have no control, for example, our skin color or our native tongue, and differences that are the result of our own conscious choices. Differences, then, that are the result of someone intentionally trying to be different. Now, those are two very different things. And it's this latter kind of difference that I'd like for us to think about today. That is to say, the differences that are the result of our choosing to be different, the result of our actually trying to be different from the other people around us. That is, after all, the essence of religion. It's what religion is really all about. For what is religion but an effort to convince people to try to be different from those around them? Different both in terms of belief and different in terms of behavior. There's even a word for this in religion, and the word is sanctified, which literally means something that is set apart, something that is different. And generally, this trying to be different is carried out on many levels. For example, as you certainly well know, there are many religious groups who adopt a very distinctive style of dress, so distinctive that you can tell at a glance who they are. As a result, you can easily identify adherents of certain forms of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity pure and simply by their dress. There are certain people you see walking down the sidewalk in Philadelphia, and you know immediately they're Amish. Now, you may not know what the Amish believe, but one thing for sure, they're different. And to a certain extent, that's the point. Religious traditions also very often adopt distinctive dietary practices. And given the central role that food plays in all our lives, this too has the effect of setting people apart, of identifying them as different. Some groups eat only certain foods. And even more distinctively, there are certain foods or kinds of drink that other groups never touch. A fact of which we all have to be very conscious these days in our increasingly diverse society. Nor is it any coincidence that the three major monotheistic traditions of the world, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all set apart a different day of the week for the worship of God. A tradition that is always rooted in some theological justification, but in practice has the very practical effect of distinguishing the adherents of one from the others, particularly so when all three are found in the same place. But generally, differences of this sort, shall we say outward differences, and in particular differences of dress, tend to be regarded as secondary to a much more important kind of difference, a difference that is usually understood to be the ultimate goal of religion, and that is a kind of inward difference, a difference of the heart and soul, which then informs every other aspect of our being. Now, that's the real difference that most religions are aiming to produce. And all of these secondary outward differences are generally seen only as a means to that end, a way of reinforcing the effort to be different then in those more important ways. I suspect that there are very few adherents of even the most rigid of religious traditions that would actually claim that the kind of clothes that one wears is a matter of deep religious significance. Instead, things like dress are simply seen as a helpful step in the right direction, in the direction of those things that are truly more important, that higher calling that is the ultimate goal of every religion. Even the Ten Commandments are not understood in Scripture as being valuable in and of themselves, though nearly all of the commandments do have an obvious practical benefit. But the commandments, as indeed the entire law, are valued because they help to shape the people of Israel into a nation befitting its status as God's own people. They were held to a higher standard, and so they were expected to be different. And living the Ten Commandments was an important step toward that ultimate goal. But, consciously setting out to be different can be a tricky business. Because actually doing so, actually becoming different from other people, setting oneself apart from those around you, can have unintended consequences. Consequences that can actually undermine the larger purpose of urging people to a higher standard. And when that happens, instead of producing better people, the whole effort can backfire, and you end up with worse people. So much so that sometimes the fact that people don't practice what they preach can actually be a good thing. Just take a look at the Middle East right now, where a little hypocrisy would be a whole lot better than the zeal that we see reflected in so many parts of that region. Now, one of the things that can happen when consciously setting out to be different is that it generates a sense of inferiority among some people, particularly children, who usually have no choice in the matter, and who are then forced to be different from others around them in a way not of their own choosing, and may respond to that reality not by embracing that difference, but coming to deeply resent it. I know many people who grew up in more fundamentalist traditions may well have seen this happen, may have even experienced this yourself. Another problem along these lines is the whole forbidden fruit syndrome, where setting certain foods and practices off limits only serves to increase their attraction, not diminish it. It's one of the reasons that in professedly teetotaling societies, alcoholism is often more of a problem than it is in those places where the moderate consumption of alcohol is widely accepted. I lived in a dry county once for a number of years, and I can tell you for a fact that there was absolutely nothing dry about that place. Now, those are problems, and they're real problems. But they're not as serious a problem as something else that can occur when people set out to be different. And that is the fact that some people, having chosen to be different, react to that experience by coming to see themselves not only as different, but as better than others. There's a fine line. And in fact, in practice, it is a dangerously fine line between choosing a higher standard of conduct for oneself and beginning to think of yourself better than others who have not done the same. There's a word for this, of course, this thinking yourself better than others. The word is pride. And there's good reason why pride has traditionally been considered not merely a sin, but actually a deadly sin. For pride does indeed goeth before the fall. And there's a reason why that's so. Why this particular form of pride can be so dangerous. Because once it takes hold, once you've begun to think yourself better than those around you, then a great deal of the original incentive to aspire to a higher standard of conduct begins to wane, because you're already there. And eventually, all that's left of that effort is merely the outward trappings of those differences. The outward trappings that continue to reinforce our sense of difference and hence our superiority, even though they were really never the point to begin with. And when that happens, then those outward differences become a surrogate for the truly important difference, the inward difference that had been the original point of the whole effort. And when you're left with nothing but the outward appearances and no longer the inward essence of that hope for difference, then you've simply become what Jesus called a hypocrite. And I don't need to tell anyone what a problem that is in all religions today. All of which is why Paul eventually gave up on all those secondary outward differences as being a helpful means to a greater end, as being helpful instruments toward some ultimate religious aim, and instead advocated taking a different path to that goal. For Paul, the goal was always righteousness, that is to say, a relationship with God. And he came to see that as a relationship that was based on faith, on knowing Christ in a deeply personal way, rather than being built out of a righteousness built upon the law, that is to say, upon all those outward signs of difference. Because not only did those outward signs all too often serve as a substitute for the real thing, which was the more substantive inner transformation, they also tended to reinforce what very often were merely ethnic boundaries, the kind of boundaries that themselves encourage feelings of superiority, feelings that I'm different from you and I'm better than you. Much better, Paul said, for us to simply focus on Christ and Him crucified as the way, and just get over all those feelings of needing to be different from people around you, and certainly get over those feelings of being better, because that is a dead end, if ever there was one. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, to whom be all glory and honor, now and forever.